Damn, son, where'd you find this? A King Major exclusive. The Cave EXE. Take it away, King Major, son. What's up, ladies and gentlemen? What's up, people? This King Major here. Look, so I'm here to tell you today that, what we are completely mind-fucked after PSYOP as a civilization and multi-purpose. But the focus of this video is to be establishing the nature of how life will most likely be projected into the near future. Now, this is taking into consideration like the 4 cycle generations every 80 years or so, with like the artist, the hero, etc., and how they transform society. I want to make a note that even with the Epstein files, the wars in Israel and Iran, the alien disclosure that is indeed happening. I mean, anybody who's not blind can tell that it's happening in the United States. Furthermore, that it's happening worldwide and has been for quite some time. But, we're focusing on the United States aspects. But, basically, we live, okay, in a transitional period in American United States political history, okay? And Donald Trump is a symptom of like a steam valve over society and how it can be maintained without causing too much ruckus within the homeostasis of the broader masses. It's its own form of, Roman political theater. Roman circus, Roman theater. It's not just the bread sports. Politics is a Roman theater within the Roman circus. The Colosseum, the football, NASCAR, the NBA, the sports, the games, franchises and tycoons. These, even the modern, clickbait, YouTube, TikTok, X, and Instagram, Facebook era influencers are their own form of it. You've got people in the UFO community on X getting into infighting. Candace Owens, Nick Fuentes, and all these people about the Charlie Kirk stuff. So there's these subsections of society, and that's what we're forming into a decentralized libertarians breakaway civilization like Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, which, to give context without tangenting too much about Mark Zuckerberg, people don't realize that they openly admit that the United States basically has the front company of Facebook and Meta, and Mark Zuckerberg is just the face owner. And if you really study it, like, it's clearly owned by United States interests to be a front company for DARPANET experiments, ARPANET. It's where the internet began. And don't give me that it started with the, Europeans, like, that Americans are just stealing. It's not necessarily that. Now, I will never take credit away from the people who helped transform it into the modern era internet. But ARPANET was ARPANET. It was a military, United States military black project endeavor turned into what it became. So, oh shit. I swallowed a fly. That's crazy. Or not a fly, but I really was just sitting here, not to freak out, but it's like this small little insect just flew in my mouth. Hold up. And that psycho shit. That's the universe talking to me, nigga. Wow. But anyway, I digress. Damn. It just got bored. We've transformed as a society into this controlled by the internet infrastructure of the West and the United States based culture. As I said in my previous video, the normie invasion of the internet ruined the internet, and because the internet is now so universal due to monetization of the internet and all things to do with personalities therein, we've devolved into an idiocracy-styled, illiterate, heavily dependent upon AI infrastructure, gullible consumerist society who has lost its identity in the transitions of technology. More specifically, non-etheric, the old ether model of science was unfavored for the more modern, Albert Einsteinian, Edison style technology over like Tesla and the ether scientists. Even though they all kind of evolved from that similar branch of technology and metaphysics and, science and experimentation. There's a lie. There's a lie that, scientists that define eras are just squeaky clean academic, goofy schoolyard pictures are nonsense. They're radical. They're eccentric. They're typically not favored by academia. One of my core philosophies is, basically the don't appeal to authority fallacy. You know what I'm saying? Study it all based on its merits. But to round back where it all began with this conversation, I want to speak about basically we have evolved as a first world nation in the United States to where we have millennials, Gen Z, Generation Alpha and Beta having some sort of generational strife with the Gen X and beyond because of the techno. Basically, it boils down to a post-World War II economy boom that led to successes. The free era of drugs, rock and roll in the 80s basically was the fantasy paradise, so to speak, of sin and vice, alongside the Dukes of Hazzard natures of rural Americas. And because you can't just leave it to Beaver as everybody. That was a Hollywood gimmick. People need to get away from this Nat Soch, Alexander Dugan based understanding that we were Leave It to Beaver. No, we were not. Brother, where art thou? Maybe. But what I'm saying is, and I hate the tangent so much because there's so much to add, but we live in a product of spoon-fed, trust fund baby gatekeeper mentalities, and we don't take into consideration, because of the dopamine fried brains of the internet consumer era and the intellectual stimulation overload of information and where it's been spread and how it's utilized, including the AI era, we don't take into consideration that we have running water in first world civilization. It's the same crises the plebeians had with Rome, infrastructure. We have running water. We can go to the local Dollar Tree, and don't tell me you can't go to the Dollar Tree and buy groceries. Okay, I get most people are living off bad. I live in a position where I have a chance to make better income. But it doesn't change the fact that the living circumstances of the first world United States is very good. You don't count your blessings, the younger generation. But, and I'm a 95 baby, I'm a Zillennial, classified between a hybrid of millennial and Gen Z. But that doesn't mean that Gen X is perfect or anything like that. Now, my father was Gen X. I was raised by my father as a single parent. And his generation basically gave us a society not worth inheriting, but in all honesty, not worth destroying. Worthy enough to maintain, but not worthy enough to champion as inheritance. And a society that we can truly make better in this transitional period, even especially with the non-human intelligence, UAP and paranormal and CIA, MK Ultra, odd tech disclosures, talking about Salvatore Pais. Finally, I've been talking about him for years. It's sad that by the time, if anybody watches this, I was a pioneer of all of this thinking. Not to say I'm the only one, but I was an early pioneer of all of this, style of investigation within ufology and what's being in the congressional hearings. Like, I was one of the early voices tagging official government handles on social media, alerting their, basically exploiting the narratives and legal process of the Patriot Act to basically get them to monitor my page, to basically have in their repertoire, if it actually goes through with keeping up with policy. Now, they might just be bureaucratic and not look into it. I try to sensationalize things with my ARGs and stuff on the internet to get there to be enough warranted for an investigation in the sense of monitoring it and tabbing it. Because the studying I've done is important. And we've developed, because of the Rockefellers and the Rockefeller Foundation and the ties between Rockefeller, the Cecil Rhodes, and the Diamond Mafia Roundtable of South Africa, the mine cartels of diamonds, Rothschild banking unions, and Babylonian money magic, basically, of this cabal. And it's not just Jewish. There's so many nuances, even in Judaism. I want to stress that people really don't understand the nuances of politics. Not to tangent too much, but do you really understand the Israeli politics? I know this platform talks heavily about Israel and Jews, but do you understand the difference between a Torah-based Samaritan, a rabbinical Jew of Eastern Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox, Orthodox, or a Reformed Jew, or a liberal Jew, a communist, atheist-style political world Jewries, stuff like that, and their influences in the politics of Jewish life, and Arabians and Semitics, because Semitic means all of the area of the Levant, basically regions of language. These people do have a history that's complex and nuanced, and if you really want to have an opinion on it, you're not going to get it from the mainstream gatekeepers on X or TikTok. They'll just say the Jews or Zionists or Israel, and it's not correct. We're talking about a people that current events with the Likud party and radical Chabad Lubavitch Messianic Jews that tie to really the structure of the Priory of Sion, more or less, infrastructure of Dumuzi and Inanna, Anunnaki worship, Elohim cult. It goes into the plurality of Elohim, and I don't want to tangent too much into that, but relating that to the original point of this whole video is the Talpiot program and the way that propaganda is administered in the new age with the fall of legacy institutional conventional styled media apparatus of newspapers, television, radio, and official syndication that's monitored by the FCC is changing for the internet-based era. And I might be one of the few in the crowd that really says, listen, these are still internet platforms. I grew up with the internet. I grew up as a fucking 6-year-old with Bonsai Buddy and getting on Newgrounds, Funny Junk, and E-Bombs World and all the forums and GeoCities. I was a really smart kid. And let me tell you that they're still just websites. You don't have a constitutional right. I don't care if you consider this place the public talking space. Back in the day, the public square and the podium wasn't heard by every single Joe in the fucking field in the continental U.S. or whatever Tartar was, or whatever the hell you want to fucking call whatever the past was. You take for granted the modern era and civilization of the internet, which has been more or less a psyop with dead internet theory, propaganda and comments and botting since the beginning, and the edgy humor of people who are constantly on the internet before the era of monetization and popularity of the internet culture, when it was still seen as oddball, weird, and kooky. These things matter. And they developed a cultural, baselessness for society now, because, which is going into my deeper point, all of these manifested psyops, all of these, like Charlie Kirk being assassinated, all of the political movements and the consumerism is all built off a foundation of, like I said in my previous video, society is developing on the internet era and personality-based consumerism and content consumption. But the internet's foundation was people that were not on the internet like fucking 20 years ago. You understand what I'm saying? So, these were people that were quirky or nerdy or geeky or code-based or alternative or chameleons in school. Most people were on pagers, like I said, or instant messenger if it's of my era. If they were even on that was so tech savvy, and that was for adults. When I was a kid, if you had something that, you played, you went out and saw girls. By the time I was a teenager, you had a cell phone, maybe, if you were lucky at my age at the time. You talked to girls, you had sex, you went to the theater, you went to the ball game, you You went to bonfires. I'm looking at the moon. I'm in straight position over. That's pretty cool. Right in front of me. I'm outside. So it's like, we've developed this cultural ethos and personality-based consumerism and content-filled, like, learning about things, and it's over, especially like the TikTok algorithm has fried the attention spans of humanity and made it like goldfish or worse, basically worse than goldfish, through 24-hour news cycles that are sensationalist and clickbait, rage bait, and none of the personalities really have true organic nature towards it. It's all an artifice like politics is. And people think that this ain't the mainstream media. Yes, your YouTube personalities are the mainstream media now. Quit saying mainstream media is CNN, Fox News. These people are dying out. They're legacy media. Mainstream media is Nick Fuentes, Tucker Carlson, Alex Jones, the podcasters like Joe Rogan, the MMA Jew crowd on X, the UFO, Red Koala, whatever the hell his name is, and Chupacabra, the internet-based decentralized propaganda matrix, people that Alexander Dugin, pay to be personalities on these alternative media sites and on X. They are the new vanguard of media. Candace Owens, like I said, all of these personalities and their storylines and their each individual niches have become the new vanguards of the mainstream media. It's all mainstream media now. Your TikTok news feed is mainstream media. Your YouTube intake of politics or whatever you consume is your new mainstream media. It is mainstream media. That old media of the old age is relic. It's history. And we live in a consumer society with the infrastructure being of the first world, and we have forgotten that we are spoon-fed with the luxury of post-World War II economic gains of the United States and the infrastructure of ARPANET that merged with the various, peoples of the world, and namely U.S. and Europeans getting together to formulate what became the modern industrial commercial product internet, and the era of early-based internet culture that was foreign to mainstream popular and consensus, what people did. What you experience is the fruit of the labors of the weird people. Chris O'Neill and Zach Hadel and all these people came from Newgrounds as low-budget animation that they just make on Flash. These are the foundations that created the now famous Adult Swim, Smiling Friends. That impacts culture everywhere. All the streaming sites. That's still mainstream, don't get me wrong. But quit framing that alternative media is anything that's relating to just a general termed content creator. Mr. Beast has candy bars, nigga. We're in the modern age. So, with all of that said and done, we're going into a nihilistic future where, no, we're not going to collapse. Even though it seems like it's late stage capitalist republic, that's propaganda, man. And if you want the truth on the United States, read Lysander Spooner's No Treason, the Constitution of No Authority. Read the inherent papers of the Anti-Federalist Party, and read the mythos of the people who were proponents of the Anti-Federalists, the Confederacy, Shays' Rebellion. Read the people who became the fallen, because history is determined by the victor. And General Shepard even said that. So if the villain's saying that, you better be paying attention. What if Watergate was never caught if you're not a believer in the conspiracy theory version of political history? Maybe you believe in accidental theory. Then what was Watergate? Maybe you believe in 9/11. What was that? Israeli Freemasonic, United States in oil tech in, Greater Yannan styled black project, false flag, JFK, what was that? COVID, what was that? What does it take? It's just like the UFO thing. What was that? What it's going to take for certain people is just seeing it with their own eyes. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's like I can show you documentation after documentation of psychic phenomena. And unless I do something psychic in front of you, or you have your own confirmations of 8 martini theory, which, like I've said before, is when a skeptic but reasonable is open-minded enough to participate in monitoring, and they start believing in psychic spooky woo. This always happens. It doesn't matter. It could be abduction phenomena, so you can't take that away from experiencers of any type. And we've got to get past this appeal to authority, because we'll always be gatekept by academia, like that said heavier than air flight was impossible, but the Wright brothers flew. Again, academia and military science said it was impossible. They flew. So to prevent this nihilistic, not even dystopia, just very nihilistic, dopamine infested, overrode and completely like filled up and tolerance and affected dopamine structures, we're going to have a branch off of people's mentalities being more nature-based, being completely cyborgized with, like, for example, the declassified Army Intelligence Corps, memo of the Cyborg Super Soldier 2050 program. Getting us on board with that, the 2030, 2040 memos that were declassified, structuring technological advancements and disclosures therein of what the United States hopes to achieve and deploy in the battlefield. Like, if you study Marine Times, or Military Times, you do a good search with .mil on the internet, and you'll find some good shit. Even if you got to go to the Brave search engine. I'm not an insider. I have unique bloodline that's typically involved with Oddfellows and Freemasons. I mean, no disrespect to anybody, I understand the anti-Masonic movement and how they basically slandered people because basically they had to take some people out. So, there's only 3 bars to standard Freemasonry. If you go beyond, you're going into non-canon territory with its own quirks and downfalls. But I'm not affiliated officially with anybody. I have family members who are in both Oddfellows and Freemasons, or formerly were, or Junior Masonry. But this world we live in is not going to change no matter how much technologically advanced we get. And that's the same thing we fail to understand with the potentials of non-human intelligence, and what I try to convey with my literature and my studies and like Skeltonic Judaism formatted, ideology and syncretism, to show you that they're not much different, that there's still a relativistic nuance and milieu of, truly grayscale in the sense of how it is performed and orchestrated, how political theory functions, and how you interpret propaganda. I know that sounds like a mouthful, but I'm trying to convey this the best way I know how. So, because we live in this age of internet-infested ideologies and warped minds, the class warfare of, basically the from basically Gen Z millennials and their problems with Gen X and boomers, and they're all sadly a product of some sort of four-wheeled generation of like the 80-year cycle that you always hear about with the hero, the artist generation, and so forth. The cycles and studying like the Cave or Plato's Republic and studying old literature but also being open-minded to question like Plato and Plotinus and how they relate, and questioning the strength and integrity of the argument of Scaliger chronology and how you determine what is true history, because there's not too many people that actually are there, but in real life, but a small group of certain individuals that we consider the bedrock of what we consider history, not having first-hand documentation of pretty much most of Rome, if I'm not mistaken. As much as we have these sources of their deep intellectual records that you study, primary sources, you're going to find it with a lot of things, you'll find it lacking. You'll find it to be connected to some individual that's connected to some few individuals that are considered the only handful that determine what we consider history. That's why I always bring up Tartaria as a significant possibility. So We need to have a good grasp, know our enemy, see how we are treated. I don't think and most people will learn they'll be consumers herded like good little sheep animal because the human was designed with special qualities to be slaves. And this has been instituted doctrine and understandings from like people like Robert Morningstar and Native Americans, which are basically a variant of Asian, Mongolian-like people. They even say that in academia. We need to quit calling them Native Americans. It's like, academia says they're Native Americans out of one mouth, and then they'll tell you in another session, another grade, so it doesn't comprehend right in your brain with the neuropathic synapses and neurons firing, that they basically told you two things, but you're supposed to believe what? The argument against white people. They're Native Americans, even though they're Mongolian Asians. And something against whitey, But Talmudic doctrine and fucking white genocide bullshit aside, the urge to have the immanentization of the eschaton or the hastening of the end times of any generic concept so we end our futile doom-scrolling lives is really not going to come. I mean, it may collapse a little bit, but, the grid collapsing. Yes, Department of Homeland Security did say to prepare, but realistically, you don't think anybody went to JVS or school for academy for technical trade, or they just know how to work shit, went to prison or the feds and, state or whatever, and they learned how to rig shit? It would go right back up. They're right back up within 8 months. They're right when they say that. All infrastructure will probably return within 8 months. People have this weird outbreak, Resident Evil, whatever the fuck they want to call it, Breaking Bad meets Undead, Walking Dead like style apocalypse where it's basically The Last of Us because basic infrastructure of Edison-based currents with the modern era collapses. Like it would not do anything but free us truly. Within 5 months, we'll have a sustainable colonies again, even if they never came back on. People would hijack the old grids and put it back up themselves. It would really be done within a month. That's the sad truth about it. If there was no regulation, once regulation and formal structure from the federal and state and city governments collapse, people will instantly start building it back up again. That's the sad, honest truth. It would be the bureaucracy that gets in the way. But, people are stupid. They'll believe a psyop to limit themselves. The gorilla sees, the people inside the cave see the fire, but they don't want to leave. Even though the door is wide open. That's been the problem with humanity fucking now since time and millennia. And only people who's going to fucking really pay attention is going to pay attention. And we shouldn't blame them in a communist, ideological, self-righteous, fury if they take advantage. That's the side of the elites. You can't just, you got to mature with society and be realistic with your ideology. So, I don't know. It's quite funny, actually. So, that's about all. Peace out.